April the 25th, 1915, men of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps landed at Gallipoli. It was on that day the traditions of our fighting forces were born. These stories of their sons and daughters at war we proudly dedicate to the memory of Anzac.
This is the story of the capture of one of the world's richest oil centers, Balikpapan in Borneo. It's a story of the Australian 7th Division, the conquerors of Syria, the men of the Kokoda Trail, of Milne Bay, Gona, Buna, and Shaggy Ridge. In July 1945 came the 7th Division's last campaign in Borneo. From Morotai, the 9th Division had already invaded Tarakan Island and Labuan in Sarawak. Now the objective of the 7th was to be the richest oil wells in the Dutch East Indies, Balikpapan. The Borneo campaign was planned at Morotai. With General Moore's head Corps Commander was General Milford, GOC 7th Division, and senior Australian and American Army, Navy, and Air Force officers. While the plan was maturing, the 7th Division had begun a tough training course on the Atherton tableland in Queensland. The 7th consisted of the 18th, 21st, and 25th Brigades. In their next assignment, they learned they would be equipped with a new kind of weapon, the flamethrower. This was a weapon of total war, the kind of war Japan itself had waged and perfected. In May and June 1945, the 7th Division was shipped to Morotai. This was the 4th time in 5 years it had sailed for service overseas, a distinction shared by no other division in Australia's history. The 9th Division was already in action at Tarakan, or preparing to fall on Labuan and Brunei Bay, as the 7th disembarked at Morotai. The men of Milne Bay and the Kokoda Trail had no doubt that they too would soon be in the thick of the fighting. In Queensland, months before, the air had been thick with rumors of imminent embarkation for the Philippines. The rumors proved false, as rumors so often did in the war. Now, as battalion after battalion of the division moved into the camps so recently occupied by the 9th, speculation flared again. What battlefield lay beyond the mud and tedium and incomparable discomfort of the giant staging camp that was Morotai? Would their way lie north towards Japan or west to Singapore? They soon knew. They were briefed about their objective. They waited. Relief maps, models, and aerial photographs had shown every platoon, every section, every man, the beaches, roads, ridges, and towns they would attack. The assault was planned to the last detail, and they were ready. 10 days after their arrival, they embarked again for Balikpapan. More than 200 vessels had converged on Morotai Harbor to launch the last great amphibious operation of the Southwest Pacific War. General MacArthur gave this operation a weight second only to that of his own landing at Lingayen in the Philippines the previous January. object of the operation, in MacArthur's own words, was to secure one of the most lucrative strategic targets in the East Indies sector and virtually complete our tactical control of the entire Southwest Pacific area. It was a fitting task for the 7th, the first Allied troops to halt and turn back Japan's army. The great convoy sailed on June the 26th. Guarding it were American, Dutch and Australian warships, including the cruisers Shropshire and Hobart and the destroyer Arunta. As usual, among the troop carriers were the former Australian passenger liners Australia, Canimbla and Manora. On July the 1st, the Armada closed in on the beaches of Balikpapan. The landing began. Arunta opens fire. Under cover of the overwhelming bombardment of warships and rocket ships, liberators and bowfighters, the 7th struck at a beachhead only 2 miles from the town, in the heart of its defenses. Their target was already an inferno of raging oil fires and choking smoke. This was the greatest seaborne operation carried out by Australian troops since Gallipoli. It was the 7th's first beach landing, and the first time a whole Australian division had landed in one operation. The might of the Allied blow, following 18 days of aerial bombardment, forced the enemy back from his battered beach defenses. Brigadier Fred Chilton's 18th Brigade, led by the 2nd 10th and 2nd 12th Battalions, landed at the south of the beachhead. Supported by tanks, the 2nd 10th struck towards Parramatta Ridge, dominating the town. They fought through minefields under stiffening artillery opposition. The 18th Brigade fought its way through a wrecked and blasted terrain, not unlike the shell-torn scene their fathers had known on the Somme. They fought their way into the blazing wreckage of Balikpapan. The 3rd, the 18th Brigade gripped the city area like a vice, and the 25th Brigade encircled its refineries. Through the gutted town and pushed into the countryside, flushing Japanese from their pillboxes. Enemy counterattacks were persistent but costly. One enemy attempt to regain a ridge above the town cost 300 Japanese lives. It failed. The installations, which supplied the enemy war machine with 15 million barrels of oil a year, were devastated. The main refinery and cracking plant were in ruins. Almost all storage tanks had been destroyed. But to the north, north of Balikpapan, there were other refineries and strategically valuable airstrips. These were the target of the 21st Brigade. Battling their way up the coast along the road they called the Basie Highway, the 2nd, 14th, 16th and 27th Battalions of Brigadier Ivan Doherty's 21st Brigade drove the enemy from the first airstrip in less than 24 hours. The cratered Basie Highway became an elongated battlefield. Tanks were thrust forward ahead of the infantry to dislodge the tenacious enemy. The 21st Brigade advanced. Ruined buildings concealed strong points. Hillsides were pockmarked with bunkers, but by July the 5th, the 21st had reached Nangar and thrust the enemy from its twin airstrip. Inland, the 25th Brigade, under Brigadier Ken Ether, drove a wedge far into the enemy's hill defences. After 10 days of hard fighting, Balikpapan and the Clandestine Peninsula were in our hands. The worst of the campaign seemed to be over. The 7th Division had fought costlier campaigns than this, but the cost was dear enough. 65 dead and 350 wounded was the price Australia paid for Balikpapan. Beyond the Clandestine Peninsula, the 7th Division fanned out, striking at the enemy's hill defences, depriving him of the power to counterattack. The 25th Brigade beat down, weakening enemy resistance. The relentless advance, supported from the air, hurled the enemy from village after village. Souvenir hunters were in luck. So were the native villagers, released at last from the Japanese military tyranny. Nothing sharpened the Australian attack more effectively than the evidence they found of enemy atrocities committed against the defenseless natives. Back at Balikpapan, the Allies raced to put the town and port back into working order. They did not know it as they poured supplies ashore, but the Pacific War had only one more month to run. A couple of axe blows, and you've got a floating dock. Transport packed the foreshores as construction units arrived. In July 1945, Balikpapan was still seen as a vital accessory to the invasion of Malaya. Ancillary troops moved in. Dock units, workshop units and the rest, all bringing new life to the shell of the city. Only a few miles away, the 7th Division harried the remnants of the enemy. The Japanese had expected the attack. They had sweated to construct obstacles like this. They had mined the sea approaches, beaches and roads. They had dynamited bridges in their headlong retreat. Now the Australian engineers sweated in their turn to repair the damage and keep supplies rolling forward. One of the first ships to follow the convoy in was the hospital ship Wanganella. On July the 5th, it brought sisters of the 2nd 4th Australian General Hospital into Balikpapan, only hours after the last enemy street fighters had been subdued. Most of these young women were veterans of war, despite their youth. They carried memories of the Middle East and New Guinea campaigns. The Wanganella, formerly a Tasman Sea passenger liner, began to evacuate 162 Australian and Allied wounded and desperately ill Indian prisoners of war. On the Wanganella, teams of orderlies, artists in speedy, smooth evacuation drill, brought the wounded over the ship's side to the boards and operating tables, where doctors and surgeons awaited them. But some, who landed on July the 1st, would never return. They'd been shot down from strong points, like this mosque, which the enemy converted into a fortress guarding the Basie Highway. The tide of native refugees began to surge out of the bullet-swept countryside into the shell-torn city. The homeless ones, the tragic flotsam of total war. Their numbers swelled steadily as the Australian advance swept the enemy from their countryside. Of the island campaigns, carriers had to be recruited to get supplies forward. The 25th Brigade's accelerating advance inland along the ruined Milford Highway posed a particularly serious supply problem. Engineers worked day and night to reopen the road. Gangs of natives were organized to help the engineers. They worked with a will. They knew that the roads the army needed led towards peace. The Basie Highway, route of the 21st Brigade's fighting advance and target of intense naval and aerial bombardment, was speedily rebuilt. It was named in memory of the 7th Division's much-loved commander in New Guinea, who'd been killed in an air crash. His funeral had taken place in Cairns only a few months before the Balikpapan campaign. The burial service was conducted by Padre Donald Reedy. Major General George Vasey fought in World War I. Was senior Australian commander in Crete and commanded the 7th at Buna, Ley and Shaggy Ridge. His successor, General Milford, and General Wootton, now commanding the 9th, were among the mourners for this regular soldier who became one of the greatest of all Australian fighting commanders. There were white crosses now at Balikpapan, too. 2 of them marked the graves of Australian war correspondents who lost their lives in the campaign. The end of the war was still not in sight, though victory was certain when the Australian Commander-in-Chief, General Blamey, came to inspect the 7th Division's prize. Blamey, unable to share in the reconquest of the Philippines, now expected that his troops would be wanted for the reconquest of Singapore. The avenging of the 8th Division seemed to be at hand. But for some men of the 7th Division, the 5-year men who had volunteered for overseas service in 1939-40, the war was already over. Honorable discharge awaited them. Who deserved it more? This was to be the last embarkation of these veterans who'd fought in Syria, New Guinea, and Borneo. With them, as well as our wounded, went Indian prisoners, victims of the death marches of Borneo. For them too, the war was over. Then suddenly, stunningly, the war was over for all. These 5-year men of the 18th Brigade still wore the rectangular colour patch, a reminder of the fact that in 1939-40 they had been part of the 6th Division. Not all went home. Some went to Japan as members of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force, there to show to the stunned Japanese population the symbols of a power against which its warlords had shattered their country's wealth, strength, and youth. There the Australians helped preside over the dissolution of the Japanese armed power. In the Dutch East Indies, officers of the 7th Division followed up the surrender with interrogations about ammunition dumps and food supplies. Strangely unreal it seemed to be able to sit and smoke with men who had sought to kill you, whom you had stalked to kill for more than 3 years. In Borneo, Major General Milford and others accepted the surrender of 21,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors and airmen, the survivors of a force twice as large as those which the Australians had whipped in the dugouts of Buna and Gona and in the mountain fortress of the Finistères. These Australian leaders, like Milford and his brigadiers, O'Brien, Chilton and Doherty, this was it, the end of the road to victory. Aboard the frigate HMAS Burdekin, the terms of surrender are stated by General Milford. The surrender is signed. The swords by which Japan had lived are given up, not without difficulty. Now the 21st Brigade embarked on its last assignment, to the Celebes, where Brigadier Doherty supervised the disarming of the Japanese and the restoration of law and order. At Macassar, a guard of honor was formed by Royal Naval ex-prisoners of war. The new prisoners were from the Japanese Navy. Amid enthusiasm from the Indonesians, Brigadier Doherty took over control of the area. At Pari Pari, 100 miles north of Macassar, Lieutenant Colonel Phil Roden, commanding the 2nd 14th Battalion, grappled with the problems of distributing rice. The economy of the country had broken down completely. Only when it became clear to the Indonesians that law and order would be maintained did native trade and commerce begin to revive. Meanwhile, ships like HMAS Gascoigne, Quiberon and Barcoo moved from center to center, rounding up parties of the enemy. At Macassar, men of the 21st Brigade moved in steadily to help restore order and speed the transition to peace and harmony. Indonesian cheers and hand claps for this ceremonial parade gave the 7th Division a foretaste of the tremendous demonstrations which awaited them at home. Home. That was what they thought of now. Home. At Balikpapan, the 7th Division sorted the spoils of its last campaign. One souvenir was this two-man enemy tankette, the first to be captured by Australian troops. Today, that very tank can be seen in the Australian War Memorial at Canberra. It's a reminder of the speed and power of the Japanese thrust, which was first halted by these men of the 7th Division. The 7th Division. They were citizen soldiers, called from warehouse, farm and desk to carry on the traditions of their fathers. They had served and fought to the end. They were worthy sons of Anzac.